There was a time when Sundays meant slow-cooked roasts, bubbling casseroles, and recipes passed down through generations. Now, most are forgotten. But for the next 2 hours, we're bringing them back. These are the Sunday supper recipes no one makes anymore. But everyone should. Let's start the video with a classic, the Johnny Marzetti casserole. If you grew up in Ohio, I'm sure you've had this beef and macaroni casserole. Now, this casserole was named after a real person. Johnny Marzetti was named after the brother of Teresa Marzetti, an Italian immigrant who opened a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio in 1896. This dish was the restaurant's most popular offering and soon became the talk of the town. In the 1950s and 1960s, Johnny Marzetti was a common item on school lunch menus in the Midwest. That's because of its kid-friendly ingredients. The best part about this one was that it could be made in advance and baked just in time for dinner, which means you didn't have to visit Grandma for this one every time. The key to a good Johnny Marzetti was the cheese blend. It was typically made with a combination of cheddar, provolone, and Parmesan cheese. Cranberry fluff salad might not be what your mind immediately goes to when you think of a good tart, or a good salad, or even a good cranberry dish, but back in the days of our grandparents, this is all people used to have. It took a lot of trial and error to get the perfect recipe going too, but they definitely did achieve what they were looking for. You could say that it was a product of fluff salad culture, which got really popular after the Second World War, but I think it was the perfect mix of marshmallows, gelatins, and cream that made this convenient dish shine like it did. Funnily enough, this dish only ever happened because fluff cooking got so popular as a result of World War II. Also because the war popularized processed and ready-made food like gelatin mixes and pre-made whipped toppings. Though these were meant to ease the war effort back then, they also flipped the script completely for home cooking. Gone were the days where you needed to do Batman levels of prep work to have these things as a viable idea for a Saturday lunch. That entire time period was characterized by grim, slim pickings that might have gotten you the nutrition you needed, but it wasn't really food for the soul. As a result, people wanted food that was sweeter, had more personality, and was just more fun overall. Cranberry fluff salad was the perfect thing, and cranberries were already something that were deeply appreciated in the States, especially around Christmas times, and cranberry fluff salads were a beloved Christmas tradition too. A boiled calf's head used to be an American and European staple, and this was largely true for a big chunk of recent history. Particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was very common for people to rely on organ meat for their daily nutrition. In fact, with this recipe, people didn't use bits and pieces of the head, but instead, the entire head, brain, tongue, and all other parts attached would be boiled until it was tenderized to the right level of softness. Then it would be served whole with a caper sauce or some kind of savory gravy. There were enough reasons why something like this was popular, mostly the fact that industrialized meat processing hadn't gotten everywhere and it was still in its baby stages, and refrigeration was just a far-off concept. What I can't understand is why some people actually thought this was a sign of luxury or wealth. Back then, it was the era of nose-to-tail cooking, but lately, it's simply become far more rare to see a restaurant sticking to that and surviving. Nose-to-tail cooking, especially when the head is still intact, just isn't as appealing as your local Subway anymore, and that's just the cold hard facts of the situation. Tomato aspic is a sort of Jell-O juice hybrid, and no, we're not even going to attempt to justify that one. Picture this: a squishy, gelatinous tomato mass on the plate, glistening as if it is ready for a 1960s cookbook. This dish was the crown jewel of Sunday supper tables for decades, and it came topped with the pièce de résistance, a nice big spoonful of mayonnaise. It wasn't just the texture of aspic that brought the dish to fame. It was a dish that said, "I know my way around a kitchen," because making one required skill. Tomato juice was mixed with gelatin and the right proportion of other ingredients such as Worcestershire sauce, onion, and celery. Once prepared, it was portioned like a cake and could be eaten as a first course or as an accompaniment. People loved to bring it to Sunday parties because it seemed very elegant and could be prepared in advance. But let's be real, its wobbling appeal was polarizing. You either thought it was the bomb.com because it was the perfect mix of sour and salty, or you were like, meh, I'll take the beans, please. Tomato aspic is now best known as a joke, but it was a popular dish when gelatin was the go-to ingredient in many recipes. Nostalgic or nightmarish? That's for you to decide. So with fish sticks and tartar sauce, the thing is, it really is a good dish. I have to give credit where it's due. It can hold its own in a number of situations. It's also the perfect kind of thing for more casual dinners, hangouts, and get-togethers too. That kind of also starts to make you wonder why something like this isn't really that popular anymore though, right? Well, I think, honestly, the trends have just changed. Fish sticks were once something that even people outside of coastal cities really enjoyed because they were almost the perfect mid-hangout food. Also, tartar sauce was hard to beat as a dip with fish sticks. They just brought out the best in each other. Now let's say you're mid-conversation during a Lakers game with your main man, and you don't feel like going to the trouble of spending an hour in the kitchen getting something ready to eat. That's totally cool. We've all been there. Let's say you're having a lazy Sunday with the wife at home and you both just can't be bothered. A perfectly normal situation to have fish sticks in. But these days, people just order stir-fry. Next up, we have the Shipwreck Casserole. If you think this name's creative, keep watching, because some of these casserole names will leave you scratching your head. So, the Shipwreck Casserole was a go-to for families during tough economic times because it was simple, budget-friendly, and made with ingredients that were often already on hand. The name shipwreck referred to the hodgepodge of ingredients tossed together as if it were a shipwreck of a meal. Grandma's pantry was almost always stocked, but during the hard times, even she had to make do with whatever was available. This delicious casserole was versatile and typically consisted of ground beef, potatoes, onions, and canned tomatoes, with the occasional addition of baked beans or vegetables like carrots and green beans. Toad in the hole implies that you might be eating a frog, and not in a way you would want to imagine, but bear with me. Look, the British have funny names for what they love to eat, but every century or so they end up stumbling upon a wonderful dish that sticks with families across countries. The USA was one of those, and it got pretty infatuated with toads in the hole. This dish is actually just a sausage surrounded by a crispy layer of Yorkshire pudding batter, which gives this dish an extremely unique texture and experience. You might taste something like this again in your life, but you won't bite something like it again. It takes your typical pork sausages, the Yorkshire pudding, a gravy made of onions, which really goes well with the sauce, and even a bit of wine or Worcestershire sauce for a bit of a more complex flavor profile. You can put vegetables, but traditional takes on the dish are often only focused on the sausage, batter, and gravy aspect. You would make the batter in like 30 minutes, because letting it rest was important. You had to preheat the pan too, so that the dish would rise properly and brown the sausages as well. This was a hard dish to prepare, which is why it was really a labor of love. If you ever had these at your grandma's place, maybe call her up and give her some appreciation for it too. It's simple, but it's a traditional British meal that made its way to America and stayed for a very long while before tastes shifted and people moved on to bigger and flashier foods that had the power to go viral on social media. It's definitely what one would consider family cooking. The jellied chicken loaf was a dish that was made from shredded cooked chicken and homemade gelatin that was made via stock or Knox gelatin packets. You had bare-bones seasonings and some vegetables like cabbages or hard-boiled eggs in the loaf, and it would be served cold as an appetizer for Sunday supper. One of the reasons people would make this dish for Sunday is because it could be made in advance and it was okay to serve it cold, which really cut the work for a lot of home chefs. Plus, this recipe involved cheap cuts of meat, and it was very economical for a lot of people. In the middle of the 20th century, there was also a rise of gelatin-based aspic dishes, but lately all that's gone in the opposite direction. Most people enjoy Jell-O in purely dessert forms now or as a quick snack. There's also just a general distaste for the texture, and for the amount of effort it takes, a lot of people think the idea of a cold jelly meat dish doesn't offer enough bang for your buck. This jellied chicken salad is the best example of how mid-century cooking can be preserved in aspic. It is the kind of thing that happens when someone asks, "How can we make chicken salad even more vintage?" Oh, I know. Add gelatin. This dish starts innocently enough. Chicken, celery, and mayonnaise. But then things take a turn. And then there is unflavored gelatin, which takes the basic salad and turns it into a wobbling tower of savory aspiration. It's kind of like a Jell-O with meat, but instead of having fruit flavors, it has poultry. The jellied chicken salad was the highlight of Sunday dinners, which, placed in its mold, was displayed on the table. Why? Because it was associated with elegance, or so home chefs thought at the time. It was cold, very manageable, and ideal for making portions for many people. Also, it went well with crackers or a crisp lettuce leaf for that extra special gourmet look. It may not be photogenic today, but jellied chicken salad was at least functional in its context. The gelatin helped to preserve the chicken, and because the meat can be molded easily, it was perfect for potlucks and buffets. Today's people may not fancy it, but there is no doubt that this dish is innovative. It is a relic of a time when people were obsessed with gelatin and a fun conversation piece for anyone willing to attempt it. If we go back to the 1970s, we're going to discover another really popular dessert, which is rice pudding. Now, far be it from me to disrespect one of the greats. Rice pudding has been around far longer than I have, after all. Still, what's true is sadly still true. The days of glory for rice pudding are definitely far away in the past now. Dude, seriously, back in the 70s, this was all people ate for dessert. How could they not? 1, it was stupid easy to make, and 2, it was really convenient and sweet. All you needed was some cheap rice and milk, and that wasn't really breaking anyone's bank account or putting their budget out of order for the month. What you would get was this perfect dessert supper hybrid that would make perfect sense to have after a big meal or even in the cold winter months. I mean, it was definitely a lot more affordable than ordering a tub of ice cream, and a lot healthier too. People have unfortunately started to head in different directions with rice, though. These days, if people do eat it, it's mostly with things like chicken tikka masala or rice bowls like katsu curry. Not really any room left in the current climate for a rice-based dessert. So, tamales are a labor of love, but thanks to Grandma, this tamale pie was a much easier way to enjoy the flavors. This casserole caught on like fire in the early 20th century, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican influence was strong. Just like most casseroles on the list, this one-dish wonder was also a creation of the Depression era. Some versions of this pie started out as a way to use up leftovers, such as bits of meat, vegetables, and even leftover chili. But hey, no one complained because the end result was a delicious dinner. Many families have an heirloom recipe for this casserole passed down from generation to generation. So if this casserole brings back memories from your childhood, it might be time to give Grandma a call. She could be holding on to a secret recipe that she's finally ready to pass down to you. Sausage balls are actually something that you can vibe with a lot easier. It's also yet another thing that we got as a result of the war and how it handled food throughout the nation. I don't think the government ever saw this kind of culinary innovation coming when they decided to go all in on rationing things and making canned food popular, but you never know what goes on in the mind of a good chef. Kind of a testament to human creativity, right? You don't have to give all the credit to them, though. General Mills also helped out a lot here. They're the ones that made Bisquick, which was this 1931 mix of baking powder, shortening, and flour. It helped in a lot of dishes, but for sausage balls, it was a key player. Though it's not the shape you're used to seeing them in, it's still the same old friend that's gotten you through several awful evening shifts and long dreaded days at university. Anyone knows that the place of sausages in American culture, whether we're talking about getting a hot dog off a street stall or prepping a proper dog on the grill at home, it's something that a lot of citizens just consider a thing you know and do. Sausage balls were a way to keep the momentum for sausages going, as everything could use variation once in a while. You take Bisquick, which gives a ready-made mix and gives a solid base for the sausage balls, and cheese, which holds the shape together and gives it that comfort factor. Stuffed beef heart actually is as weird as it sounds. An entire beef heart had to be cleaned and stuffed before the dish was a meal, and while this might sound like some rich person's hobby, just collecting beef hearts to cook. It was actually a frugal meal. The heart was a very tough organ. It was covered by hard muscle and tissue that just made it very undesirable for customers and butchers alike. Most shops would discard it or sell it at a fraction of the price they were selling other things. Hence why a lot of people took to this, not out of a craving for beef heart, but just so they could stretch their paycheck a little longer. Again, nose-to-tail eating did decline, but even then, this is just as extreme as a calf's head. Why do we have to eat either the head or the heart? You tell me. Either way, I'm glad that this is out of style because I genuinely cannot imagine what I would do if I visited someone's palace and they served me a heart stuffed with cabbage, lettuce, and onions. Like, that's scary. Milk toast was the best comfort food before macaroni and cheese became the king of all comfort foods. This dish, which was as easy as it was old-fashioned, was one of those that families who preferred comfort to glamour would cook for Sunday supper. Here's how it worked. Pieces of bread were baked until they became golden brown and then soaked in warm milk. On top of it, butter was spread liberally, and at times a dash of sugar or cinnamon was also sprinkled. The outcome was a soft, cozy meal that could be described as a hug in a plate. Milk toast was not only a meal, it was a tradition. It was given to kids, the elderly, or anyone who had a cold, and it was the food equivalent of a warm blanket. Though it may not look like much by today's standards, back then it was a luxury to have when ingredients were rationed and money was even more limited. What is interesting is that milk toast has sunk to oblivion, which is rather surprising given the fact that it was popular in the past. Perhaps it is too simple for today's taste buds, or perhaps it is just that we have lost touch with how good simple food can be. In either case, milk toast deserves a second chance, or at least a second glance, for anyone who wants to take a trip back in time and sample a dish that is as mild as it is meaningful. Speaking of stir-fries, one of the more common ones that wasn't inspired by Asian culture was actually cabbage and sausage stir-fry. And this is definitely something you'd only see in the 70s. First of all, let's be honest. How many Gen Z or Gen Alpha kids do you know that would genuinely ask for cabbage stir-fry for lunch? Uber Eats has the game on deadlock, and that means that people really don't eat stuff like this anymore. Back in the 20th century, though, it was possible for something like cabbage to rise to stardom and even stay at the top and maintain a chokehold on people's diets. Why? Well, that's partially due to the 3-decade-long period filled with 3 history-defining disasters in the 20th century, namely the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the World Wars. Quite a trifecta, isn't it? Still, that's when cabbage got so popular in America as a cheap and affordable nutrition-filled option that people started to eat it almost non-stop. Adding bits of leftover sausage to the stir-fry gave it a neat little protein element, and that cemented the dish as a rustic 20th century classic for when the going gets noticeably tougher than usual. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. Johnnycakes, Johnnycakes, whatever ancient name you know them by, this is another example of Americans trying to keep the love of sausages alive by putting new spins on dishes. Sometimes they were new ones. Sometimes they were ones that already existed for a while. A lot of people were pretty familiar with Johnnycakes already, but the sausage version was something that was made by the people of North America. They started off with the indigenous communities over there, and ground corn was a big part of their daily routine. They started using ground corn to make these flatbreads, which were the basic breakfasts in North America. Eventually, farmers started getting their hands on a bit more pork than before, and thus sausages were brought into the mix. It's really a great lunch or breakfast. Doesn't bloat you, doesn't leave you running close to empty still, and feels great while tasting delicious. People kind of debate where the name came from, though. There wasn't really a Johnny that made this dish popular, nor was there any kind of historic or iconic journey that it was popular with. I guess maybe you could call it an offshoot of Johnnycake, which was a New England term that was used for cornmeal cakes and the like, but then again, it's not really the same. Either way, what we're concerned about is how it takes a sausage and makes it shine. It didn't start out this way, as in the North it was really just more corn than sausages. When it hit New England, it was a breakfast meal that would come with molasses or syrup. In the South, you'd instead have cornmeal pancakes, and over time, more and more breakfast items kept getting tacked onto the dish until we hit sausages. Spam and Lima bean casserole is every bit the atrocity it sounds, and it's one of the worst things we've ever done as a country with Spam. A salty and processed pork product that was supposed to make life a lot more convenient for everyone wasn't supposed to be used like this, and I'm glad we can agree with that. Mostly. The middle of the 20th century was a scary time because it was wrought with economic strife. Your neighbor could genuinely ruin your entire week with one of these, especially because this was supposed to be a budget-friendly meal for families. Lima beans, cream sauce, and breadcrumbs or cheese. Who could possibly think that was a good idea? Spam just used to be so available that people were making anything. And the middle of the 20th century was also a time when casseroles were slowly reviving and fusion food was slowly beginning to take off too. But this isn't the direction you go in, and I'm glad people left this in the last century. It's still not as bad as the next one, though. If you thought that meatloaf was the most divided dish, let me present to you its distant relative, liver loaf. This dish was the answer to the question, what do we do with all this liver, of the 1950s? Spoiler, they shaped it into a solid loaf and then proceeded to smother it in thick brown sauce. It was the epitome of the all-in-one meal that sought to get as much nutrition as possible and then some out of a piece of offal. The ingredients were basic, but not plain at all. The liver was raw and minced and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and only a pinch of spices to cover the raw smell of the liver. Baked to a golden brown, it resembled a meatloaf, but when it came out of the oven, it smelled like liver. The gravy was mandatory. Its richness was meant to complement or mask the assertiveness of the loaf. The liver loaf had its followers, especially children who grew up during the Depression and the Second World War, when organ meats were cheap and rich in iron. But it also had its critics, usually young members of the family frowning at the table while Grandpa was telling stories about the great past. Today, the liver loaf is considered to be a kind of gastronomic antique. It may not sit on the modern Sunday table, but it is a perfect example of innovative and frugal cuisine. Who knows? Perhaps it is time for a return to the 80s. Another thing that was really exclusive to the 1970s was the country's rediscovered love for casseroles. Things like hot dog casseroles are just proof of this all around. But really, you had a casserole for just about every fruit, ingredient, and meat you had ever heard of. The deal with this one is that it was a cheap casserole and a super beginner-friendly one. Seriously, your nephew could make this if you gave him honest instructions and believed in him enough. I mean, what really is there to do? You just take the pasta and the hot dogs, layer them casserole style, and pop them in the oven. Bam, you're done. And now you have enough food to either share with the family twice over or enough to last you the entire day and then some. Casseroles were super easy to make, convenient, and usually affordable, but could be made with super fancy ingredients if you were feeling like pushing your wallet and could fit just about any taste palette in the entire country. That made them pretty damn hard to beat. Plus, the 70s was known for being a massive return-to-work culture and the grind lifestyle for a lot of Americans, so the need for big, easy, and simple dishes was major. Nowadays, there are a lot of convenient apps and services to do that for you, so there's no need to bother with things like casseroles every other day. Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menu soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Here's a dish that's actually something that'll get you feeling all warm and fuzzy. After all, what else does a good chiffon cake do? And there's no better one than coconut chiffon cakes. These started becoming popular in the late 1920s, and the earliest reference I could find was of Harry Baker, who kept a secret recipe for 20 years before it finally became public in the 1940s. Before he decided to share his secrets with the wider world, most cakes were pretty heavy and required a lot of batter. That wasn't really to the liking of the upper class, especially when we talk about Hollywood stars who Henry was known to work for. They preferred foreign styles of making cakes, and especially in Europe, chiffon cakes were really popular. Henry got a solid grip on the dish because he prepared so many of them for their special events, and eventually, he developed a perfect recipe that even General Mills had their eye on. When they did get it, they started promoting it in their Betty Crocker recipes, which was a surefire way to bring the cake into the mainstream. That's some real commitment to the bit. But his recipe was sought after because even despite how chiffon cake is naturally a pretty light and airy cake, his was like a floating cloud with the best parts of coconut milk and extract. Also, the shredded coconut on top and the cream of tartar really gave it that finishing touch. No, very few things on this list are as bad as this one. Liver and banana casserole was definitely an event in American history. You would combine sliced liver with bananas that had been baked in either a creamy sauce or a really savory one, and then some versions even added cheese on top of it. What people would do to convince themselves that this was tolerable was remind themselves of the fact that the liver is a superfood. You can kind of eat healthy if you treat it like any other chore, right? You get lots of good things for time spent doing something you absolutely hate. Typical job experience, right? Not even that kind of practical rationale could help this dish. A lot of people immediately realized this was an absolute catastrophe that should not ever see the light of day. Fair play to them, not every experiment is going to give you lasagna or salmagundi. But this couldn't have possibly come at a worse time. The liver was already in the public eye for its metallic taste and how bold of a flavor it had. But this was just pushing more and more supporters away from the liver fandom. Then again, if that's the price we had to pay to make sure this thing stays dead, then so be it. It's a quiet Sunday at the dinner table and you're ready to dig into a plate of golden brown codfish cakes with creamy peas. This meal wasn't just a dish back in the day. It was a solution to tough times. Codfish cakes, made with salted cod, mashed potatoes, and a little seasoning, were a frugal way to turn pantry staples into something special. The creamy peas, a luxury addition that made you forget you were eating on a budget. The real MVP of this recipe was salted cod, which could sit in the pantry forever and still come to life with a good soak. The cakes were fried up crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, like edible comfort. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. On the other hand, creamed peas made a basic veggie rich and buttery. They balanced each other out like the perfect culinary couple. This isn't a meal that gets lost in the shuffle. And it's the kind of dish that makes you want to call your grandparents and ask for their secret recipe, then spend the evening wondering how a simple can of peas and some codfish could taste so good. Despite what I just described about the 70s with casserole, you gotta believe me when I say something like zucchini fritters was also at the forefront of the entire decade. That's the thing about the 70s. It's just got so much going on that you can't box it into any single trend or sentiment that was spreading like wildfire. I mean, sure, there was an immense crowd that deeply preferred casserole-style dishes, and they stuck to that belief hardcore, but there was also a big chunk of America that was tired of the high-calorie, high-prep lifestyle of making big dishes that would last you a while. They wanted to switch to greener food that would help keep them lean and food that would also work with the party culture that was getting so popular during the 70s. People wanted bite-sized snacks they could gobble up when they were tipsy at parties, not big banquet dinners they had to sit down for and really make space for. Lots of people were treating eating as an excuse to socialize and go out, instead of finding genuine new food or eating for sustenance like in the first half of the 20th century. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. If we move on over to the South for a bit, we're going to find that these people dearly love their potato salads. Who can blame them? Region to region, there's no family that doesn't have a deep, intimate relationship with the potato. Arguably one of the finest things to ever come out of Mother Nature, and especially when you make a shout hallelujah potato salad. Before you ask in the comments, I'm just as lost as you on where they came up with the name. I mean, maybe they were Jeff Buckley fans? Side note, I really hope you get the reefer either way. This salad really did want to make you yell hallelujah, so there is that. It just isn't very often that you come across a salad that has it all, you know? The taste, the binge-eating potential, the perfect texture, and the health benefits. This one takes hard-boiled eggs, scallions, paprika, mayo, and potatoes, and a pretty tangy dressing. This is one of those dishes that German immigrants first brought over with them, and I'm personally glad they brought the best of their kitchens. All in all, if you're trying to find a new way to have a delicious salad, this is definitely the best thing on the market. It'll get you feeling fuller and healthier, and it's a lot better than a greasy street-side sandwich which your doctor may be recommending you to eat a lot less of. Sardine whips were a dish that had the texture of a mousse but the taste of canned sardines. Whipped cream, gelatin, and cream cheese can work wonders in terms of texture. But when you throw something like sardines in there, you just ruin the whole thing. The mixture was also whipped to the moon and back until it was as light as a cloud. So, in terms of preparation, I think people did whatever they could to make this appetizing. Unfortunately, nothing can mask the stage-stealing taste of sardines, and I do not use that term in a good way. The fishy taste was way too overpowering for a lot of people, especially Americans who had grown up in the South or in places that did not have any fishing or seafood culture. What seafood people did like was typically grilled, roasted, or just fried. Gelatin-heavy party foods were also falling out of fashion, and those were just too many nails for this recipe's coffin. Just think about eating fluffy and warm bread and getting a delicious combination of spiced meat and soft cabbage instead. You know, something that is just perfect for comfort food, right? Meat and cabbage pockets were the quiet stars of the classic Sunday dinner that could be eaten with the help of two hands while being warm and enveloped in the embrace of dough. Favorite with farming families and immigrant populations, these tiny morsels offered both cheap and hearty meals for many people, for the cost of a $5 or less. The filling was a basic but enchanting mixture of ground beef, onions, cabbage, and a pinch of salt, pepper, and occasionally caraway seeds. It was a hand-rolled dough, which was then folded around the mixture before being baked to a golden brown. These pockets were not only tasty, they were useful. They could be prepared beforehand, warmed up for the second time, or placed into a basket for a picnic. While they may have a cousin in the modern empanadas or pierogies, there was something special about beef and cabbage pockets. These were the main dishes of any family dinner, gone before the Jell-O mold even got on the table. Today, they are a reminder of the past when Sunday supper was a tradition of coming together for a good meal and people Yes. Again, disrespecting an icon has never been my scene, but I just don't think peanut butter sandwiches are anyone's go-to breakfast anymore like they used to be in the 70s. Really, when was the last time you stopped and made yourself a genuine peanut butter sandwich you were looking forward to right before heading out for work or college or whatever it is? People would much rather prefer to either grab some takeout, get a cute little coffee these days, or just take their Stanley bottle with whatever electrolyte-boosting drink of the day they have. Don't get me wrong, kids and teens will still eat these up, and they make for some amazing late-night snacks. But I feel like overall, we've started to move on a bit from the days where peanut butter sandwiches were reigning supreme over all else, you know? But hey, if you feel differently, please make that known in the comments. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Graham's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Graham could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Speaking of comfort food that doesn't ever really get old, let's talk about Big Mama's egg pie. Funny name, right? A lot of people think the title came from the rural South. There, the mom of the family was often always in charge of deciding how the family would eat, a lot more so than other communities. They became known affectionately as Big Mamas, and it was a pretty cute honorific for Southern Black families. That's how they'd refer to the grandma or the eldest woman in the family who would cook all the delicious things you guys grew up on, like this pie here. When the Great Migration happened and those communities first flocked to America, they brought over a slew of family-friendly recipes with them, this egg custard pie being one of them. I didn't really get it either until I found out the history behind egg pie and how it's a staple of Southern homes. Basically, if you live up there, you've been around the block with this pie a few times. The custard eggs really need to be whisked properly to get it right though, but that's something grandmas, or as this dish would refer to them, Big Mamas were pretty well acquainted with. The best thing about custard pies was probably how easy it was to make them, which is also how they ended up getting so popular in the first palace. The ingredients were something you'd find around anywhere, really. You don't get a gray hair cooking food for a family on a yearly basis and come out of it with no tricks with basic things. If you boiled cabbage in milk, you either were pretty bad at judging what a dish would end up tasting like, or you just had a fondness for experimenting. Cabbage and milk stew was this incredibly simple dish that you would make with butter, salt, and a bit of flour for thickening, but it was just that. Simple. Delicious? Good? Palatable? None of those things. The entire idea of this was that it was cheap, healthy, and took no effort or ingredients to make, which meant that it was something that was most popular in rough times. We talk a lot about the resilience of American people through the Depression, but we don't talk enough about how glad they were to leave meals like this behind once their situations improved. Nobody liked the thought of cabbage and milk stew after a long, hard day working and laboring or taking care of the kids and managing the house. The textures were really bad. Boiling cabbage meant that it would release a really pungent aroma. The texture of this was soggy, the taste was sour and bland, and there were just better ways of being healthy if that was your thing, especially with the advent of canning things. Pork cake is as literal as it gets and as strange as it sounds. No, it's not a dessert. Imagine meatloaf and fruitcake got together and decided to create something truly unforgettable. A rich, meaty bread containing pork and spices, slightly sweet. Pork cake was a Sunday dinner in the South, the sort of dish that made your neighbors look at you funny and your relatives beg for the recipe. The name was as unusual as the ingredients used in preparing the food. In a bowl, ground pork was combined with breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices such as cloves and nutmeg. Some recipes even contained a hint of molasses or brown sugar to give an extra hint of sweetness to the savory. The loaf was baked until firm, and then sliced and served with gravy, or for the more adventurous, a side order of applesauce. You must be wondering why anyone would go to the trouble of making a pork cake. Well, it was a good means of extending meat since one could only afford a small piece of meat, but had enough beans to make it go around. Besides, it was very spicy, which was quite different from the usual meatloaf that I am used to eating. It was filling, surprising, and, to be quite frank, peculiar, but peculiar in a good sort of way. Today, pork cake has nearly vanished from tables, but remains in the recipe books of those who enjoy retro foods. Whether you like it or not, it is a piece of history that needs to be discussed when it comes to our culinary world, or at least for the controversy it brings. Egg group soup is still something you could say is a popular wintertime snack for a lot of people and definitely a comfort food for a niche crowd. But it's not something I would say is in its prime anymore. There were and still are an incredible amount of fans of Chinese cuisine. If anything, that number has only continued to increase with no signs of stopping. I mean, geez, these days we even prefer their TikTok to our own, right? Anyway, that kind of stuff is exactly why egg drop soup got a bit left behind though. You keep getting exposed to a culture over time, and you start to see more and more of it. More traditional recipes, foods, street foods, heritage dishes, all that. You start to leave behind the popular staples that you once went to because you didn't know anything else. It's unfortunately the same deal for things like chow mein and Szechuan chicken, as good as they are. And don't get me wrong, there's a sizable audience for egg drop soup, because who can beat something that's simple and effective? I'm just saying that the audience used to be more regular and bigger. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day, because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? I don't really know what the trend was, assuming that mothers as a collective were tied to these dishes. But Mama's cheese straws are another highlight of anyone's time in the South. Cheese straws themselves are something that have been around since the very earliest cocktail parties, but it's in the South where cheese is revered as the holy grail of dairy, where dishes like these first got a lot of steam. Do you think this is an appropriate dish for a wedding or a birthday? That's exactly where it would be served a lot of the time, though. Maybe that's surprising, but I don't exaggerate when I say this dish had crowd-pleasing power, and it had it in spades. The thing with these is that they actually are so popular because of how easy it is to get everything you need for them. I'm not playing with you when I say the hardest thing to get on the list is the cheddar cheese. The dish itself is these long, thin sticks that get baked and are served alongside snacks. Either way, whether you have this as a standalone dish or an appetizer, you're in for a pretty good time. The mock duck was a substitute dish for duck meat, also made in times like the Great Depression, mostly because duck meat had become such a luxury. There was a type of gluten made out of wheat known as seitan, and you would roll that and stuff it to make this. Conceptually, I think people were trying to mimic duck breasts. You would pan-fry these just like them too, or roast them and serve with any kind of gravy. Now, this doesn't really sound that bad, right? Relatively normal compared to the rest of the nightmares we've been going through. Wrong? It was made of organic meat, or strictly vegetarian ingredients, both of which were really bad at capturing the texture or flavor of duck, or just coming anywhere close to it, really. The only momentum this dish had going for it was that veganism was on the rise thanks to health concerns, overfishing hazards, and environmental damages. People were significantly more excited about real duck meat when it did eventually become affordable and accessible, and most mock food is now left behind in the past. Let's be honest, it was smart, but that doesn't mean it was good. Don't worry, no rabbits were harmed in the making of Welsh rabbits. This misnamed dish was ooey-gooey cheese sauce poured over toast and comfort food that made Sunday supper feel like a cozy celebration. The name is from the 18th century British humor that gave it the name poor man's meat. But the flavor? Rich and satisfying. The real star was the cheese sauce, made with sharp cheddar, mustard, and sometimes a splash of beer or Worcestershire. Once it bubbled up and got all melty, it turned a simple slice of toast into something decadent. It was cheap, quick to whip up, and downright indulgent, and families loved it. Welsh Rabbit was also a good way to get rid of the cheese drawer, which, let's be honest, is the most underrated kitchen space. These days, it's basically a fancy cousin of cheese fondue, but back then it was a lifesaver for families trying to stretch their groceries. It still holds up today. Serve it with a side salad or a dollop of chutney, and you've got a meal. Before I get into why it died down, first, I need to talk about what a Hamburger Helper even is. This was a packaged convenience food product that General Mills came up with in 1971, and it was a big part of their whole Betty Crocker shtick. The idea was to make something out of a pound of ground beef, and despite the name, there's no hamburger ingredients besides the beef. You had a box with dried pasta, rice, and a seasoning mix. It actually became a big thing in the 70s because it became a symbol of processed food and was one of the most popular packaged products in the nation. On the other hand, it is definitely something I would say is entirely nostalgia-driven now. Hamburger Helpers are still available, and they're a convenient meal to go for. Don't get me wrong, but the days of its trends are dead in the water and in the past now. People would go out in droves to get a fix of a Hamburger Helper back in the 70s, and this was a very much socially expected thing to do, by the way. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Okay, I know you're getting just a little bit tired of hearing about the South, but it's not my fault that so many of America's best hits in the 20th century, like Southern sweet tea, are from there. Sure, they might be mostly forgotten now, but if you go just a little back into their heyday, you'll find one of the tea from the most well-detailed and in-depth cups of tea you'll ever have. While the only ones you'd find these days having a genuine cup of green tea are suburban wives who have the time to spend fine-tuning every part of their health, or men who think herbal green teas excuse pounds of bacon and beers over the weekend, Southern sweet tea became a classic for a good reason. That reason was the Prohibition, when alcohol in general was banned for 13 straight years. Back then, people didn't have non-alcoholic beverages like they do today. Sure, there was root beer, but who really cares about that besides 16-year-olds? And don't even get me started on how awful non-alcoholic wine used to be. There was one savior that was slowly making its way into the social zeitgeist of American cooking, though. That was black tea. Because while Americans usually had green tea right from China, after the war, America and China weren't so friendly. As a result, they didn't share much either. They then started importing black tea from Sri Lanka and India, which was popularized as sweet tea in the South due to the insane amount of sugar and sometimes corn syrup they would add to this. It would be added hot, then served over ice, so it was really a great alternative to alcohol. It had everything you wanted in tea, and it worked really well if you added lemon into it too. Honestly, I think oyster and prune stew is one of the least offensive ones here. It's an unusual combination, that's for sure, but that doesn't make it as much of a menace to society and culture as liver and banana casserole. This had briny, salty oysters mixed in with really sweet and stewed prunes. I can imagine what the idea was and what kind of vibe they were going for, but I think the execution failed the dish. The dish was really trying to take after some European-influenced cuisine, as you can probably tell by the fact that the broth was made with cream, butter, and usually French wine. Oysters were really cheap back in the 1800s and even in the early 20th century, and they were a staple meal for coastal communities like we talked about. Prunes were also something people genuinely loved and paired with meats often enough. European cuisine was slowly taking over American kitchens as more and more people wanted to experiment and try it out for themselves. The pieces were all set. You just had to put it in motion, but once people did, they realized this wasn't actually that good of a combination. It clashed too much with the sweetness of the prunes instead of contrasting it. Plus, overfishing meant oysters were generally being consumed less thanks to pressure from governments and environmental groups. Prunes had a fine reputation, but they were a side to steaks and stuff. Here's a sandwich that knew how to spice up Sunday supper. Soft white bread with a crunchy side of celery hearts, and deviled ham. Deviled ham is ham with an attitude, spiced, minced, and mixed with mayo or mustard for a creamy spread that's as packed a punch as it is. In the mid-20th century, canned deviled ham was a pantry staple, often sold in those tiny paper-wrapped tins. Salty, tangy, personality-loaded, it was spread thickly on bread and served with crisp celery hearts as a light, tasty meal. The celery wasn't for show, it was the perfect crunch to help balance the richness of the ham. It wasn't the kind of Sunday supper you spent hours cooking, but it was good. It was a little spicy, kids loved it, adults loved it because it was effortless, and everyone loved it because it was delicious. Deviled ham has pretty much faded into history, but its memory lives on in retro recipe books and maybe in your grandparents' memories. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, there were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. Whether you call it Holly Dolly bars or 7 layers, everyone has a fond memory of the biscuits we will talk about now. Hello Dolly bars were one of the nicest treats made by graham cracker crumbs, chocolate chips, sweetened condensed milk, and some of the freshest butterscotch chips you can imagine. This is a pretty vintage recipe. It goes back all the way to the 1960s. They gained a lot of attention as a bake sale treat that kids would peddle for a modest price. It's kind of like a good mix between a biscuit and a yeast roll, but its real charm is in how soft it is. The rise on these biscuits thanks to the yeast and the baking powder is something you can't match with any other biscuit on the market. Again, we have an aspic dish, and by this point, you might be able to piece together that people really went overboard with them. By that I mean too much experimentation is also a bad thing. Beef tongue in aspic is one of the biggest examples of that. It was a really classic European-style dish, and it had boiled beef tongue, which was still something people were a lot more open towards given the times. The issue started when people began to encase it in aspic, and the gelatin was also made from bone broth. It would be flavored with vinegar or wine and herbs, and the dish would typically be served cold. Now, I just want you to imagine that for a second. You're eating beef tongue, which is hard, chewy, and just foreign to you texture-wise, boiled, cold, and encased in jelly with distracting herbs thrown in. Can you actually believe this used to be something people had at formal dinners? I mean, I get throwing meat in a spick because it lasted longer and refrigerators weren't a thing, but this has to be some kind of food sadism. Hot water cornbread wasn't a dish. It was a Southern tradition. This skillet-fried bread was simple but divine, made with just cornmeal, hot water, and a pinch of salt. It was crispy on the edges, soft in the middle, and toasty in flavor that was hard to resist. Until you paired it with buttermilk gravy, it was next-level Southern comfort. Creamy, tangy, and often with a bit of bacon grease or sausage drippings for extra flavor. Buttermilk gravy was the rule. The cornbread was a sponge, and every last drop was soaked up, and each bite was a piece of heaven. It wasn't fancy food, but it was soul food all the way. Hot water cornbread was cheap, quick to make, and incredibly versatile, and it was popular. Whatever you served it with, it could be breakfast, dinner, or dessert. It's not as common anymore, but for those who grew up with it, it's still a favorite. You're missing out on a Southern classic that needs a revival if you've never tried it. Grits with cheese were one of the staples of Southern eating and culture for the longest time before Americans moved on from cornmeal. Hey, I get it. I'd probably tire of it if it was one of the only things I grew up on. People were just used to eating corn in all of its forms, and cornmeal was one of the most popular and normalized ones. As a result, cornmeal grits were common in most homes. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it really didn't matter. People could honestly just walk into a diner and expect them to serve grits. You didn't even have to take a look at the menu, since any roadside place worth its property value in salt would be serving one. Hell, they were easy enough to make at home. The cheese addition also made it a lot more palatable and made more Americans willing to try it. As far as Southern staples go, this one gets some use still, but only by old heads who remember the days of when you would have this for comfort food instead of a Big Mac and extra large fries. You can't possibly reminisce about Grandma's forgotten casseroles without bringing up the ham and potato casserole. This one combined two classic comfort foods, ham and potatoes, and instantly became a favorite on the dining table. You know, all those leftover ham that goes bad in your refrigerator after the holidays? Well, this recipe was a way to spice it up and turn it into something new, and of course, Grandma did it best. There was even a healthier version of the ham and potato casserole that was made using lean ham, low-fat dairy products, and extra vegetables to boost the nutritional content. Grandma used whatever potatoes she could find at the farmer's market, but this one could be made by a variety. Some recipes called for russets, while others used Yukon Gold or red potatoes, depending on your texture preference. Sweet potato casseroles with marshmallows are another side dish that were one of the most widespread Thanksgiving dishes. It became associated with the holiday because of the marshmallow aspect. While normally you'd think of getting turkey or some kind of sauce-based dish for Thanksgiving, a lot of people would have sweet potato casseroles with marshmallows instead, especially in the South. There was this one company that was really good at making them, the Angelus Marshmallow Company. They would usually promote their dishes a lot, and this was one of their top hitters. It was also something that got really popular for Christmas. It's like marshmallows are just built for the holiday season, no matter how you spin it. Hog maw was even worse. This was entirely the stomach lining of a pig. That's about as disgusting as it gets, but it gets worse when you get to the rest of the recipe. You would create this mixture of sausage, potatoes, onions, and spices, and then you would stuff the stomach lining with that. This wasn't the last step, since you had to boil it too. Now, some people baked it, but boiling it typically was the way to go because the stomach lining needed to be tenderized. This was something you would see a lot in Pennsylvania Dutch communities and Southern cooking. Some regional differences were things like whether or not the entire stomach would be served or whether it would just be used as a casing. Nose-to-tail eating had become extremely popular in the early parts of the 20th century because the mentality of not wasting a single bit of the animal was what kids had grown up on. Combine that with the fact that you'd be helping Dad out by taking one for the team and eating this with a smile, and you had both a logical and an emotional reason to force yourself through this. Even that couldn't save hog maw for too long because the preparation for it was just as much of a headache as eating it was, which really just made people question what they were even doing with this recipe anymore. Let's talk about a dish that was basically the Beyoncé of mid-century Sunday suppers. Chicken a la king. Tender pieces of chicken swimming in a creamy sauce with mushrooms, peas, and sometimes a little sherry for that fancy touch. Pile that goodness onto a warm, flaky biscuit, and you've got a meal that can even cheer up the grumpiest of family members. Chicken a la king wasn't just food, it was an event. But moms everywhere whipped it up to show off their cooking skills and use up leftover chicken. It made the rounds on dinner tables, at potlucks, and even at a church social. Some trace its roots to New York's Delmonico's restaurant in the late 1800s, but by the time the mid-century rolled around, it was a full-blown household staple. So why did it disappear? Maybe because we collectively decided carbs on carbs were too much. Spoiler, they're not. Or maybe it's because pre-made biscuits fell out of fashion, and suddenly this creamy dream was consigned to the history books. Chicken a la king deserves another shot. Hearty, comforting, and endlessly customizable. It's a great dish. One of the soups that took off during the 1970s was stuffed cabbage soup. Remember how I said people really became besties with cabbage overall? Yeah, that meant that they were exploring its potential in every avenue of food known to the average American Joe. You had cabbage casseroles, cabbage stir-fries, cabbage stews, and now stuffed cabbage soup. I mean, on the one hand, it was boring as anything could be, and it really needed a lot of aromatics and seasonings to become something you could justify spending time on. On the other hand, it was dirty cheap, like unfairly cheap. And for some people, it was just free. That's right. If you had your own farmland with a crop-growing culture in your family, then you were likely raised growing cabbage, or at least having it in the home a lot. In rural areas, low-income ones and urban ones, for different reasons, whether it was the economics of it at all or the fact that modern American consumerism as they knew it was slowly heading to massive health problems for all participants, people flew like moths to cabbage soup. Speaking of veggie casseroles, the cabbage roll casserole was another hit on the dinner table. Don't we all love some good old-fashioned cabbage rolls? Well, this recipe took the labor-intensive meal and turned it into something simpler while retaining all the delicious flavors. Now this casserole has its origins in Eastern European cuisine, where cabbage rolls are a staple. It was a combination of recipes found in countries like Poland, Russia, and Hungary. Cabbage casserole not only tasted delicious, but also provided many health benefits with every bite. Cabbage is a nutritious vegetable that's rich in vitamins C and K, fiber, and antioxidants. Delicious and healthy. What's more to ask? Grandma Dallie's honey granola is as much of a vintage family recipe as it gets. The dish is also insanely healthy, and it shows how seriously Americans started taking their eating towards the end of the 20th century. Honey granola used honey nuts, oats, dried fruit, and a lot of toasting in the oven. It started to evolve into a homemade meal, and people started to customize it more and more with nuts, seeds, dried fruit, and every other thing they could get their hands on. Frog leg fricassee was this stewed dish that would involve frog legs that had really just been browned lightly in butter. They were simmered in a really creamy sauce too, with wine, onions, garlic, and herbs. Doesn't sound bad, right? I'm sure a sizable amount of us have gone fishing for frogs, maybe even eaten a few in our lifetimes. At least our older viewers might be able to relate. The idea was basically that you would sauté meat and stew it in this white sauce, and then you would use seasonings as per your taste. Most people kept it aromatic and herbal, but there were people who tried different spice rubs as well, typically in the South and Midwest. Wild frogs also used to be abundant in rural America in general, and a lot of people just thought they were a really convenient source of protein. Frog legs were still something that French and Cajun communities ate occasionally, but many people thought it was very off-putting. Besides, amphibians are usually seen as weird. It's not the kind of meat people are used to eating. They're not even farmed that much in the United States. It's not seen as exotic, quirky, trendy, or experimental. It's just odd and strange to people, which is a big part of why frog legs fell off. You have no idea the damage bad social perception can deal to a recipe's lifespan. When you have leftover chicken or crave something cozy, channel those 1950s vibes and whip this up. Trust me, it'll feel like a time machine to comfort town. Salmon loaf probably doesn't sound glamorous, but in the day, it was the pride of every thrifty household. Canned salmon, cheap and shelf-stable, breadcrumbs, eggs, and a few secret seasonings, and voila! You've got a loaf that's economical and oddly elegant. The lemon sauce was what really set salmon loaf apart. It was tangy, buttery, and slightly sweet, and it made the dish from a budget meal to a Sunday special. Don't be fooled by the canned salmon. This dish was full of protein, omega-3s, and enough nostalgia to take you straight back to Grandma's kitchen. Salmon loaf became a hit during the Great Depression and World War II because it was an inexpensive way to stretch ingredients. It was surprisingly versatile, plus it would be good for Sunday supper or cold the next day with a salad. The kind of dish that made you feel fancy without spending a fortune. Salmon loaf is long gone from today's menus, but it's a reminder of just how resourceful home cooks were back then. If you're a little adventurous or just nostalgic, give it a whirl. You never know, you might have a new old favorite for your Sunday table. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili in vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. Eggplant Parmesan casserole is another Italian classic that became a favorite in the United States. Eggplant was often a challenge to serve to picky eaters, so Grandma got creative and found a way to sneak it into delicious dishes, which resulted in the creation of this hearty dish. In Italy, it's better known as Parmigiana and is a popular gourmet dish. The casserole is a more laid-back version of the delicacy, as you can enjoy the flavors of this classic Italian dish without all the work of frying each individual slice of eggplant. Don't get me wrong, Gram loved making us those labor-intensive meals, but even she deserved a break sometimes. And this casserole gave her the perfect opportunity to whip up something delicious without spending hours in the kitchen. Your grandma's gingerbread pancakes were a very special type of spiced pancake that had flavors like ginger and cinnamon, plus molasses too. You could think of it as like a spicier pancake or gingerbread, though gingerbreads themselves have been around for ages, with popular meals like gingerbread houses being the pride and joy of both cooks and Cabbage across many countries, especially the USA. This fusion of both gingerbreads and pancakes happened as a result of fusion food culture in the 1930s to 1970s. People loved to mix and match pre-existing dishes to create wacky combos, and sometimes you got pizza burgers, which weren't really that much of a hit, and sometimes you got gingerbread pancakes. It was like Russian roulette, but with food, and despite how these only came around in the middle of the 1950s, they really held their own. It became something that families could enjoy on a budget because it really didn't take anything. But it was a recipe that was in its glory days during the start of the 19th century. That's why only grandmas and the like remembered it. It has all the sweetness of a regular pancake, but it has a slightly spicier aftertaste too, thanks to the cinnamon and ginger. Tripe and onion casserole was this slow-cooked dish that people made with beef tripe, which was the stomach lining of a cow. I know we've had some really bad casseroles on the list so far, and I genuinely am sorry for exposing you to the evils of our nation. Tripe and onion casserole was really just this slow-cooked dish that incorporated beef tripe with a vegetable butter-based broth. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what tripe is, it's the stomach lining of a cow. As you can probably guess, most of the items on the list are organ meat recipes, and they fell off badly. I've never seen something have a downfall like this. Tripe was readily available, it was practical and inexpensive, and it was also tender. This was one of the few things on the list that didn't have an immediately offensive texture, So there is always that. It still couldn't last in the long run, though, because tripe simply had too much of an aroma that I can only best describe as the scent you would associate with a barnyard. On top of that, the gelatinous texture wasn't something people were down for, and most people would instead just go for normal or better cuts of meat and ration those out according to their budget, rather than bother with recipes like this that just made them feel bad after eating. Back in the day, ham mousse might sound like the punchline to a retro food joke, but it was the height of sophistication. Picture this. It was pale pink mousse, quivering ever so slightly in a gelatin mold, surrounded by a fancy garnish of parsley or maybe even radish roses. The kind of dish you'd see at a mid-century ladies' luncheon or a formal Sunday spread. To make ham mousse, you'd first puree ham with mayonnaise, cream, and seasonings like mustard or Worcestershire sauce. The mixture was then poured into a gelatin-lined mold and chilled until set. The result? A salty, creamy spread that was perfect with crackers, celery sticks, or rye toast. Ham mousse is a little odd by today's standards, but it was a marvel of ingenuity. Even leftover ham had a second life as a party centerpiece in a time when nothing went to waste. Plus, gelatin molds were all the rage, and if you didn't have at least one on the table, were you even hosting? Ham mousse is a quirky piece of culinary history, and these days it's more likely to get laughs than admiration. But that's just how it goes. It's sure to be a conversation starter at your next gathering. Try it out. Now, I'll tell you what worked in the South and everywhere else. Fried bologna sandwiches. Hey, even the vegans had to reconsider. If you can't beat them, join them, right? No, seriously, these sandwiches were just that good. I don't know if they made bologna better back in the day or if they just laced it with magic drugs, but people were addicted. And I mean bad. This was the working class meal, especially in rural areas. Bologna wasn't only just delicious, it was also insanely affordable and one of the easiest meat products you could ever hope to get. In a post-war America where meat prices still hadn't fully recovered and become what they used to be, bologna sandwiches were more or less a godsend for everyone in the country. A budget-friendly meal before your long, grueling shift with a dash of protein to save your day and nutritional needs. Frying the bologna was also something people deeply took to because of how much flair it would add overall. A simple slice of bologna and some bread slices became the saving grace of many people's days back in the 70s. The turkey noodle casserole wasn't the only way of using up leftover turkey from the fridge. Turkey tetrazzini was another delicious dish you could make the morning after Thanksgiving. This casserole typically started out with a base of spaghetti, along with a creamy sauce that's usually made from a combination of broth, cream, and sometimes cream of mushroom soup and vegetables like peas, carrots, or celery. It was named after the Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, who was known for her performances in the early 20th century. The dish is believed to have been created in the early 20th century, coinciding with Tetrazzini's rise to fame. Many recipes included cheese, such as Parmesan or cheddar, which made it kid-friendly. This was another great example of how Graham could make something so delicious out of leftovers that might have otherwise gone to waste. Another classic of the 90s that came right from the kitchens of grandmas all over was Grandma Buttermilk Syrup. It took a tangy, sweet syrup that used buttermilk, sugar, vanilla, and made a tangy syrup which wasn't overbearing with its sweetness. It started off as this dish that became a rural area-only thing, because the syrup itself was something you could get a lot of mileage out of even if you were stepping away from making pancakes for a bit. And hey, it happens, you can't always chow down on the same thing again and again without something new to keep you excited and on your toes. Plus, some people just lived real far away from any store that had pancake syrup pre-made, and for them, this buttermilk recipe was a savior. Tomato surprises were hollowed-out tomatoes that had been stuffed with fillings you probably won't be able to guess, even if I pay you to. Hollowing out different kinds of vegetables, fruits, and peppers was a common and beloved culinary trend in America. But this was just taking things way too far. You know how some people just live for watching the world burn? I think whoever first came up with this recipe was the textbook definition of that personality type. For the atrocious fillings, you had tuna salad, shrimp salad, deviled ham, and eggs, And for the sweet ones, you had jellied fruit, cottage cheese, and whether or not you can believe it, marshmallows. It was actually considered a cocktail party snack at one point, and the entire idea behind naming it Tomato Surprises is that you really won't be able to tell what's in the damn thing. You'd be better off if you could, since then you'd know not to ever pick these up. Some foods should come with a warning, you know? Like, I get having creative party food, but you shouldn't sell your soul out just for that. Let's start with a dish that might sound like a dare. Beef tongue stew. I can tell you before you wrinkle your nose, this was the kind of meal that made families sit up and ask for seconds. Beef tongue simmers low and slow with onions, carrots, and potatoes, becoming tender slices of savory goodness. Pot roast with a little extra, wow, really? On the side, basically. The beef tongue was a budget-friendly protein back in the day and didn't skimp on flavor. When you were trying to stretch a meal without sacrificing heartiness, it was a kitchen MVP for Sunday suppers. The trick was boiling the tongue until tender, peeling off the outer skin, not as gross as it sounds, I promise, and letting the tongue soak up the rich, brothy stew. When people started preferring pre-packaged convenience over kitchen craftiness, this dish fell off the map. Beef tongue stew is a culinary throwback, but if you can find a tongue at your butcher or muster the courage to try one, then it's worth exploring. It's earthy, tender, and the sort of meal that makes you feel tied to a simpler, thriftier time. Who knows? It could become your next Sunday's favorite. Something else that was also insanely popular and stopped being that way was oven-baked chicken drumsticks. This is also something I will entirely, and many food analysts and critics will agree with me on, fast food. See, why would you ever bother with the laborious process of marinating drumsticks, gathering the ingredients, making up a spice blend, making a sauce, making a dip, cutting up fries, and going to the store for some affordable soda when Kentucky Fried Chicken has a deal out for a 3-piece combo for $10? Is $10 outrageous for a 3-piece combo? Most assuredly. Is KFC still undoubtedly delicious, convenient, and deeply ingrained into the American cultural zeitgeist? Absolutely. It's not even that there aren't any benefits to making this stuff at home. There are an insane amount of arguments and good reasons as to why it is healthier, smarter, and more economical to just handle your cravings at home with an air fryer, some olive oil or vegetable oil, and drumsticks you know you can trust. People don't work like that, though. And unfortunately, the saying that humans are creatures of habit couldn't be any more true. People are far too hooked on fast food chains for their supply of fried food, especially classic things like drumsticks. And that just means that ovens don't see a lot of use outside of TikTok trends and one-off videos that content creators might do. You might have never heard about this next one unless you grew up in Memphis, but trust me, it's worth knowing and tasting. So, Tennessee onions consisted of thick slices of sweet onions smothered in a creamy, cheesy sauce and baked until golden and bubbly. The key to making this one stand out from all the other casseroles on the table was the sweetness of the onions. Vidalia onions were often used because of their natural sweetness, but any sweet onion did the job. This wasn't necessarily the star of the dinner table. It was more of a side dish that complemented other main courses like grilled meats or fried chicken. Grandma Cheryl's bagels are some of the best bagels you can find. Getting tired of the greasy street ones that don't ever seem to do the trick? Forget those, this is the real deal, right from the cookbooks of 1,000 grandmas you'll never meet, but with all the ingenuity and love that they put in their cooking. It's most popular in Jewish communities because the very first Jewish immigrants from Europe actually brought it over with them. We aren't really sure if there was an actual Cheryl among them who made this dish into what it is today, but what I do know is that there is a lot of community love for this dish. It became known specifically for its softer texture. Most bagels in that era were really stiff, and the pastry was really chewy. In Jewish communities in particular, there was a lot of love for that aspect of the dish. They loved softer bagels that were different from the street-style ones you would usually find. It's not often you get to have such a nice, new, and fresh take on bagels, but when you do, it makes for a great dish. Veal kidney pie was this savory meat pie that had been filled with sliced veal kidneys. And that's every bit as metallic as you're imagining. The fact that people would try to salvage it with onions, mushrooms, a rich brown gravy, and different kinds of herbs was really just a Band-Aid fix. Kidneys themselves are an organ meat that have an incredibly intense flavor, much like the liver does. You mix that in with more veal meat and savory ingredients, and you're honestly just going overboard. People didn't really realize that and thought that more might be better. Well, sometimes, less is more, and this is one of those times. Veal kidney pie really wasn't anyone's cup of tea. I mean, it was popular in some Southern and African American communities, but even then, that was like farmsteaders and people who had grown up on nose-to-tail cooking. Most of the general population aside from that was very much not accustomed to such overwhelming flavors and thought that this was too gamey for their preferences, and as a result, it ended up being left behind. If fried cornmeal mush isn't your thing, you obviously haven't ever had it fresh from a skillet. Sunday morning classic, hot and drizzled with syrup. This golden, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside dish was a golden. Imagine it as the rustic cousin to pancakes. Simple, hearty, and oh so satisfying. Mush was made of humble cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge, poured into a loaf pan, cooled, sliced, and fried to perfection. This was a family staple in the early 20th century as a way to stretch budgets. Cheap, filling, and adaptable, corn could be made into bread or fritters. Fried mush with syrup? That was the weekend treat. Its versatility made it so special. It was served sweet by some families, and others topped it with gravy for a savory twist. Either way, it was the best comfort food. And the crispy edges? Absolute heaven. Fried cornmeal mush is a nostalgic gem that you have today, and it should be on your breakfast table. Try it yourself. Dust off your cast iron skillet, and you'll see why generations before us couldn't get enough of this crispy, syrup-soaked delight. So it's not like the 70s were just a period of bad eating, bombastic food, and a lot of good music. It was also the age of fusion food. Ramen stir-fry kind of comes out of this sort of environment. Seriously, people were doing nothing if not experimenting like mad scientists. They were mixing up every food and recipe known to man in an attempt to crack the code at finding the perfect next big thing. Ramen stir-fry, despite how bad people wanted it to live up to their expectations of the next big thing, could not be that, unfortunately. The idea was to take instant ramen noodles and mix them up with the usual assortment of vegetables you see in most stir-fries. And for a time, that worked, but it just wasn't really innovative enough. I mean, ramen on its own already had a decent amount of vegetables and non-meat-related toppings in the broth. The ramen stir-fry that was being made was sort of an attempt to mimic a vegetable-based pasta dish, but it was just okay. Like, nothing spectacular. People still make it for casual snacks and food, and that's pretty much how it was conceived back then, too. Let's be honest, no one did casseroles quite like the Southerners, and their classic cornbread casserole spoke for itself. Cornbread has been a staple in many grandma's kitchens for generations. It's often passed down through family recipes, with each grandma adding her own unique twist. This is one of the most famous members of the casserole families and was a staple at family dinners and potlucks. The best part? Anyone could make it. Yes, it was that easy. You just had to mix the ingredients, pour them into a baking dish, and let the oven do the work. It was a great everyday dinner, especially for busy cooks looking for a fuss-free meal. You could also customize this casserole and experiment with different types of cheese. Speaking of something right out of Great Britain that got a lot of traction in Uncle Sam's backyard, Nanny's Newfoundland tea biscuits are a mouthful to say, but something that'll keep your taste buds very satisfied around breakfast time. They shine the best when served with molasses, peanut butter, or strawberry and raspberry jam, and they're really popular in North America and New England. The best part of this dish is how quickly you're able to make it and how you can enjoy it with your afternoon tea. This is a wonderful culinary tradition, and a lot of people have kept it going by serving it up at parties and high teas. Poached carp in milk was a dish that incorporated freshwater carp, which can be a really wonderful thing to work with. That is, if you know what you're doing, which the inventor of this dish clearly didn't. You gently simmer the carp in milk, and sometimes you throw in onions, bay leaves, nutmeg, or parsley, But the method was essentially just for softening the strong taste of the fish. Carps just look gentle. When you get to eat them, they can be just as overwhelming as any kidney pie or liver-based dish. It was really common to see this in Scandinavian and Eastern European cooking, but those were much different times. Carp used to be something people also relied on when they wanted to do nutritious cooking, but slowly, the poor fish would find that the cards were stacked up against it. Carp is a muddy-tasting fish, and it doesn't have a lot of goodwill with people. It's seen as unappetizing and bony, and there also just aren't that many chefs who specialize in making the most out of carp. Plus, as developments in fishing kept increasing, there were more easier and delicious options like blue crabs, for example. Nobody ever complained about blue crabs. Also, no one liked their fish poached in milk. Who thought of that? Seriously? Onion pie doesn't sound like a headliner, but this savory masterpiece was a Sunday supper hero in its day. A humble but luxurious dish of caramelized onions, rich cream, and flaky crust came together in layers. This was the kind of meal you closed your eyes and savored every bite. This pie wasn't only delicious, it was practical. Onions were cheap, easy to store, and full of flavor, so they were a staple ingredient for frugal home cooks. Simple pantry staples were often enriched with eggs, cream, and a dash of nutmeg or cheese, making it feel like something special. Savory tarts were a common way to showcase vegetables, and onion pie's roots can be traced back to European cooking, especially in Germany and France. Immigrants brought the idea to America, and it became a comforting staple in farming communities where onions were plentiful. Onion pie has all but disappeared from today's dinner tables, but it's worth rediscovering. Serve it with a fresh green salad or alongside roasted meats for a Sunday supper that's as timeless as it is delicious. Trust me, this pie is not boring at all. It's a flavor bomb in disguise. Cornbread and beans are another one that we unfortunately just left behind in the 70s. Healthy eating like that looks and sounds real good on paper. And don't get me wrong, people find ways to make it work in real life and practical application too. I mean, it didn't get to being such a popular staple crop for no reason, you know? Unfortunately, people tend to get tired of what they become too codependent on. Corn was abused so much as a crop during the 20th century, whether it was the massive amounts of overfarming for big-time canning companies or whether it was the massive amounts of corn that people were farming and putting to use during the Depression. Suffice it to say that cornbread definitely wasn't something people were waking up excited for, at least not well into the 2000s, when they were exposed to so many options from other cultures. Beans are still a regional favorite, and in the South, there's still a deep-found appreciation for cultural foods like black beans. They just don't really make the front of the cookbook anymore, you know? Speaking of cheese, does anyone here remember the infamous cheesy broccoli rice casserole? I'm sure you have childhood memories of running away from this one because of the broccoli. Yeah, wasn't broccoli everyone's biggest enemy growing up? Well, this casserole made you hate the green veggie a little less. The cheese topping was used to hide the greens in the dish and trick kids into eating this bad boy without making any fuss. You had to get your nutrients in one way or another, and this casserole made it 10 times better. Broccoli is packed with nutrients like vitamins C and K, fiber, and antioxidants. This casserole turns the nutritious vegetable into a kid-friendly dish that the whole family can enjoy. Shredded wheat is one of those classic breakfast cereals that got marketed as a health food because of the heavy emphasis on wheat here. It was made by Henry Perky as a nutritious breakfast, and he was actually credited with making the shredded wheat machine too. This helped a lot in separating boiled strands of wheat into thinner ones. Those were then used to form biscuits and would then be baked. The best part about this machine and method was that it let you have all of the nutritional value of an entire wheat kernel instead of how others would lose some of that in the preparation. Of course, he'd go on to make a company off of the idea too. The cereal machine company in Denver and Colorado started to produce shredded wheat on a smaller scale but bumped things up with a shift to New York. The rest, as they say, is history. It was delicious, and it was made from whole grain wheat. A big staple of healthy eating in the 20th century, it made its name because everyone realized their cholesterol and blood pressure is getting way out of hand. It was out with the bacon and BLTs and in with the salads and oats, or in this case, the wheats. The best part about the dish was that it was really versatile because you could make any kind of biscuit from it. Boiled eel with parsley sauce was this traditional British dish that should have just stayed there honestly. While I'm all for cultural appreciation, sometimes they just don't have good ideas. Why would you want to skin and chop freshwater eel and then boil it? And then there's the sauces. A sauce is supposed to help make a good thing better. It can't make a bad thing good, even if you make it as flexible as possible. And most flexible sauces are bare bones with some citrus elements. You just don't manage to make the dish click. Eels had some practical reasons for being eaten, which was largely just the fact that they were extremely abundant in North American rivers, but eel was also really affordable in markets if you were not near a river. It had a lot of fat and enough protein for people to consider putting it in their diets. The free aspect was the biggest draw for the crowd, really. Unfortunately, that's always an advantage that people end up abusing maliciously because overfishing concerns were a big part of why this dish fell off. That and eels were both weird to eat and unappealing to look at. Eels were slimy, they looked like snakes, and they were not that appealing to most people who had grown up on meatloafs and sandwiches. There was also a distaste for boiled or steamed fish, which probably stemmed from the fact that people spammed that technique as much as they could during the Depression. Spam casserole might not have been glamorous, but it was a Sunday night legend. Picture this: cubes of spam layered with creamy mushroom soup and crushed crackers baked until bubbly and golden. The meal was salty, savory, and the kind of meal that made everyone forget they were eating canned meat. Mid-century families found spam to be the ultimate convenience food. It was introduced during World War II and quickly became a pantry staple, especially in the South. It was the perfect way to stretch it into a hearty meal that fed a crowd in a casserole. Canned green beans or a sprinkle of cheddar, and you had a dish that felt like a celebration. Spam casserole was so iconic because it was so simple. There were no fancy ingredients, no complicated steps, just a can opener, a casserole dish, and a little creativity. It also had that irresistible combination of crispy topping and creamy filling that made casseroles so popular. Spam may not be as cool as it once was, but this casserole is a sentimental nod to a simpler time when families conjured magic from pantry staples. Bring out your retro recipe cards and give it a go. Who knows? It might just win you over. Shredded pork tacos, on the other hand, are still something that I can confidently say has kept up with the local scene. Do you know how many gaming sessions, yap-offs, and movie nights have been spent preparing, assembling, and binging no tacos? I mean, it evolved from a street food to a party snack to a regular daily part of our lives. You just can't separate America from its tacos anymore, but does that mean there's equity? Is the socio-political state of the taco world a hierarchy where others sit at the top and some get to be stuck at the bottom ladder, forever lost to time? Or is it a spectrum where we all happily enjoy every variation of taco ever and just decide where we want to go on the spectrum to get what we enjoy? Unfortunately, the truth is a mix of both. Now see, lots of tacos have come and gone. That's no secret. Some had a lot more pull than others, and some were a lot more palatable to mass tastes. Shredded pork tacos were something that were really just a showstopper for the taco scene in general. Before this, you had your usual assortment of chicken bites, pinto beans, sour cream, and some veggies. But no one was really delving into pork territory. Did it last all the way to the big 2025, though? I can't say it did. I just don't see enough shredded pork tacos anymore out in the street to count them as being popular, especially in this day and age, where the meaning of the words trendy and popular continue to evolve every day thanks to social media. Now, let's hit pause on the hearty casseroles and turn our attention to a timeless classic: chicken pot pie. The dish became especially popular in the US during the mid-20th century with the rise of frozen meals. Brands like Stouffer's helped bring chicken pot pie into the frozen food aisle, and it soon became a favorite. I'm sure you already know, but it's a type of meat pie with a top pie crust consisting of flaky pastry. Different regions have their own takes on chicken pot pie. For example, in the southern US, it might feature a biscuit topping instead of a traditional pie crust, while other regions might use different seasonings or ingredients. This delicacy isn't only famous on menus. Chicken pot pie has made its way into literature and pop culture. For instance, it's featured in various novels, movies, and TV shows as a symbol of home and comfort. Pickled pig's feet were a really common dish in the southern, Midwestern, and Appalachian areas, and they were even beloved by immigrant communities like the Pennsylvania Dutch. So why is this here? Despite the way that eating the entire pig was normalized in those regions and how cheap pigs' feet were, people soon began to get really tired of them. America as a whole started becoming a lot more curious about what lies outside of the typical practical cuisine they've cultivated. The cornbreads, the pig's feet, the chitlins, what else is out there? That's a big part of why offal and nose-to-tail eating started declining. There were also health concerns with pickled pig's feet. They're really high in fat and sodium, and as we got closer and closer to the 21st century, that became too much of a no-no for most people. It's still Southern soul food, and some people make it out of tradition anyway, but it's largely just fallen into irrelevancy. Pineapple and cheese casserole might sound like an identity crisis, but I promise it works. A combination of sweet pineapple chunks, shredded cheese, buttery crackers, and a hint of sugar made for an unexpectedly addictive flavor combo. It's like your grandma's kitchen all of a sudden decided to have a party without you. Sunday suppers often featured this southern favorite alongside baked ham. The casserole's sweet and tangy notes paired well with the saltiness of the ham, and it was a hit at family gatherings and potlucks alike. It was one of those, is it a side or a dessert dishes that people would come back for seconds on. The origins of this quirky casserole are murky, but that's the southern way of taking oddities and turning them into culinary gold. Cheese and pineapple? Sounds weird, tastes amazing. But add a crispy cracker topping and you've got a dish that is part comfort food and part conversation starter. Pineapple and cheese casserole may have fallen from the mainstream menu, but it's time to bring it back. Bring it to a potluck and serve it at your next holiday meal, but be prepared to explain why this unlikely pairing works so well. Spoiler, it's magic. Baked ziti is still, on the other hand, something I would say does get a lot of action, even today though. Sometimes these American trends confuse the life out of me. Like, I just don't get why baked ziti would outpace shredded pork tacos, you know? It doesn't make sense. It's like saying you'd expect, I don't know, U2 to outlast Coldplay. I mean, sure, maybe I'm on the younger side when I say this, but U2 had some hits. Coldplay though? That's kind of my outlook on the whole situation. If you think baked ziti deserves to be in the 2020s with us more than some other items on the list, feel free to disagree, and actually, disagree pretty loudly in the comments. Back to baked ziti though. So here you have your usual pasta cheese affair, which seems to be a combination that, across all ages, Americans can't seem to get enough of. It's cheap, it's economical, and it's definitely healthy. Still, it's bland, a bit uninspiring, and, well, just overdone. This is also why you don't see most people making baked zitis outside of 30-something suburban moms. This next one remains a favorite at the holiday dinner table. I'm talking about the cheesy hash brown casserole. This dish is also known as funeral potatoes because it is commonly served as a side dish during traditional after-funeral dinners. However, it is also popular at potlucks and other social gatherings, sometimes under different names. The dish usually consists of hash browns or cubed potatoes, cheese, onions, cream soup or a cream sauce, sour cream, and a topping of butter with cornflakes or crushed potato chips. It typically uses frozen hash browns, which makes the preparation quick and easy. While it was often served as a side dish, cheesy hash brown casserole was also enjoyed for breakfast or brunch. Now, that's a breakfast I'd never skip. Moreover, this dinner meal is so famous that during the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, one of the souvenir food pins featured this casserole. Blueberry crunches were one of the best bakes you could have for breakfast. If you're a fan of all things berry-related and you want more of that in your diet, then you need to pay attention to this one. Did you know we actually used to eat a lot more berries and stuff as a nation? I mean, cranberries alone made up a lot of Christmas sales because people would go insane for sauces and the like. Strawberries, whenever they were in season, were always something companies needed for Jam's row desserts. By comparison, blueberries have been a bit underrated, but this dish really showcases how well they can work if they're given the chance. This has a bread or oatmeal base, and it's topped with oats, breadcrumbs, or nuts and dried fruit. It's up to you. It's kind of a sweet breakfast casserole. The entire idea of a breakfast casserole is a pretty ancient one, but this is a modern rendition on it comparatively because it only came out in the last century. Man, I can't tell you how many grandmas would spam this dish whenever they'd run out of things to make. It was like an old reliable. You know what I mean? The perfect kind of thing to feed a hungry crowd. Sure, you had your blueberry pancakes and your muffins, but that doesn't have the sheer star power of a casserole. Steamed cabbage rolls in buttermilk sauce were supposed to be a fun little variation of stuffed cabbage rolls, except they faced so much backlash. This was something that was a mixture of Scandinavian, Eastern European, and Mediterranean cuisines. America was really starting to take on its reputation of being a cultural melting pot by the middle of the 20th century, so there were a lot of different and new experimental dishes that were being tried out for the first time. The rolls were just boiled cabbage leaves that had been stuffed with a lot of ground meat, some rice, and spice rubs. They would be steamed and then served with a creamy buttermilk sauce. And this sounds pretty good so far, right? It's literally just a green wrap. Unfortunately, the buttermilk sauce part is what ruined it. People thought that it did not suit the recipe at all, and it actually distracted you from the cabbage roll way too much. Plus, it also made the cabbage soggy, diluted the flavor, and just did not mix well with the rice inside, which would also get really soggy from the sauce. This is a lesson, folks. It's not enough if your dish just tastes good. It needs to feel good too. Deviled eggs are retro, but how about sardine stuffed eggs? The hard-boiled eggs stuffed with a creamy yolk mixture spiked with mashed sardines were the ultimate Sunday supper appetizer. Before we knew what umami was, it was salty, savory, and packed with umami. During the early to mid-20th century, sardines were a pantry staple. Cheap, nutritious, and easy to store, they were a go-to ingredient for thrifty home cooks. A clever way to take a simple dish and make it special was to mix them into deviled eggs. Plus, sardines gave a briny kick that complemented mustard and paprika. This was not just practical, it was a crowd pleaser. Sardine stuffed eggs were the kind of appetizer that would get people talking, whether served at church socials, family gatherings, or Sunday dinners. And eating. A lot. They might sound like a hard sell today, but don't knock them until you try them. The health benefits and bold flavor of sardines are having a bit of a renaissance. Make a batch of these retro gems and you might even convert the pickiest eater at the table. You'll at least get major nostalgia points. So it's pretty much the same deal with chili con carne. It used to be known as chili with meat and was extremely popular in the 70s, but it ran out of luck. Despite how it was used to being known as the quintessential American comfort food, it was just something that stagnated. In Texas and the southwestern areas of the United States, it was arguably the most popular it had ever been. Canned chili brands such as Wolf and Hormel also made it really easy for people to make stuff like this, and you had every beginner-friendly recipe available in cookbooks all over libraries, magazines, shops, and just anywhere, really. Chili con carne, for these reasons, managed to stay pretty relevant despite entering the game fairly late. It evolved into a lot of different variations and styles because not everyone has the South's preference for diarrhea and inflamed mouths, but it was seen as healthy, or at least it had the potential to be. Vegetarians even started pushing their own plant-based substitutes for the meat elements in the dish instead. I think chili bowls and canned chili in general are just falling out, it seems like these days. People go for more tamer flavors. Of course, we saved the best one for last. You could never go wrong with a good old classic baked macaroni and cheese. Whether you're 5 or 45, I'm sure you're a fan of this casserole. The dish is believed to have originated from Italy, where pasta and cheese were combined as early as the 13th century. However, the baked version we know today became popular in the United States, particularly in the southern and midwestern regions. The classic recipe calls for cheddar cheese, but you can mix different cheeses like Gruyere, Parmesan, or mozzarella to take it up a notch. Many schools throughout the U.S. offer it as a lunch option because who doesn't like some good old mac and cheese? Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, was a big fan of macaroni and cheese. He's the one who brought the recipe back to the US from his travels in Europe. Plus, it's even better in the form of a baked casserole. Let's go a little bit towards what's underappreciated on the savory side of things, shall we? I'm specifically talking about mushrooms and how dishes like caramelized mushroom and onion frittata didn't come back into style until the middle of the 20th century. That was when the interest in foreign cooking first and started growing really strongly, and people wanted to move on from the coq au vin and the beef Wellingtons, instead preferring to explore more of what other cultures had to offer. Italians actually pioneered this dish, so it was definitely on the list for restaurants to incorporate and people to try. It's an egg dish, but it's an open-faced omelet that's filled with mushrooms, onions, and spices. It gets caramelized to bring the sweetness out of the onions, but the toasting works wonders for marshmallows too. It sounds like a simple dish, but people would mix it up with incorporating leftovers into it too. They would put in vegetables, meats, and cheese, and it would give the frittata a lot of personality and substance. Besides, no mushroom dish is lacking in style, right? Salmon mold with mayonnaise glaze faced some of the same trials and tribulations that steamed cabbage rolls did. Namely, the side they were served with ruined them. For the rolls, it was the buttermilk sauce, and for this, it's the mayonnaise glaze. There are lots of different glazes to throw on a jellied dish, and you need to be really thoughtful about what kind of glaze you use because depending on the kind of jelly and protein you're working with, it could go sideways really fast. That's doubly true if you're working with something like salmon. Jell-O and Knox gelatine were something people were okay with when they were at parties or their home, but they got sick of every new trendy food being another mold-based dish. People decided that if they were going to have a sustainable relationship with Jell-O, they would need to let go of all the savory stuff that didn't work. The 1930s to 1950s was also a period where people did nothing but use mayonnaise in whatever they could, and it honestly just didn't work. People began to be burned out from it, and they started to hate this dish, which was a mix of both things they were done with, Jell-O and mayo. Scrapple is the answer if you've ever wondered what happens to all the pork parts nobody wants to talk about. This zero-waste dish is the ultimate pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices combined into a savory loaf that's sliced and fried until crispy. Scrapple is Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen hailing, designed to stretch a small budget and a whole hog. It's got the texture of a crisp-edged pancake and the heartiness of sausage, making it great for breakfast or dinner. Hot, with a drizzle of maple syrup or a dollop of apple butter is best, though the purists say that ketchup is the only way. One of Scrapple's biggest charms is its versatility. You can eat it sweet, savory, or somewhere in between. Its name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue as gourmet, but Scrapple has a rustic appeal that has kept it alive in some corners of the country. For some, it's nostalgic. For others, mysterious. But it's definitely food with a story to tell. Scrapple, though it's not so much a thing these days, deserves a comeback, if only for its use of everything but the oink. It's a poor man's pâté or an ancestor of food sustainability, but it's proof that resourcefulness can be delicious. Spam fried rice and the question of its immediate availability really are something that you would have to think about region to region. In Hawaii, in 2025, I guess, yeah, you could find places that were doing it or really just make it yourself with any cheap brand of Spam. Everywhere else, though? It hasn't been such a good century for pineapples, really. The anti-pineapple propaganda press has never eased up entirely, at least not since pineapple pizzas were the next big laughingstock of the internet in the 2010s. While the days of hating on things like that are far in the past too, the general divisiveness on pineapples and therefore Spam hasn't really gone. Spam fried rice struggles to find a place for itself among today's menus of vegan-friendly food. Fusion food from a mix of 3 different cuisines and cultures, fast food, convenience food, and all the other options that overwhelm our budgets and minds daily. In all of that, why look towards that lonely little can of Spam and a bag of rice? There are killer delis just down the corner, you know? And they deliver. So, that vegetarian chili I was just talking about. Yes, it was its own kind of thing, and yes, it flopped kind of how you would expect it to. I won't say it flopped entirely, since it really did find a place for itself, unlike Spam fried rice and a niche fan base to call family. Unfortunately, that niche fan base and the overall population of the country have both moved on from chili in general. In the South, if you described vegetarian chili to anyone, they'd probably giggle or tell you to eat something real. In urban places like upscale neighborhoods in New York, it was probably a fairly decent and affordable snack. I mean, it's not like this would really take a lot of effort from anyone's side. All you had to do was dice up some cabbage, lettuce, onions, and peas and throw it in that chili, get a good mixing going, and you had a bowl ready. Unfortunately, as far as tastes and preferences go, both basic vegetables and chili have started to become used in many different ways. If people crave spice these days, they just go to an Indian restaurant. They don't waste their time with a chili bowl like people used to. I know I said people were throwing out the BLTs, especially variations on the dish like BLT egg bakes, but it really wasn't easy for them. BLTs were something that got so deeply ingrained into the culture of America that breaking up with them was an actual struggle. You know how you change your dog's favorite food because, well, it might taste good, but it gives him a lot of vet runs down the line? Or how you have to change your favorite snack because the other one's just too bad for your teeth or something? Letting go of this baked egg casserole was hard, man. The BLT sandwich has a lot of history. It goes back to the start of the 1900s, and it was one of the first simple American sandwiches that people started playing with. Egg casseroles and bakes, on the other hand, would become a mainstream home chef classic in the 1950s and 60s, where there was just a large focus on bakes and egg-based dishes. It's because they were so easy to prepare that they got as popular as they did. They also worked the best with sandwiches, so it seemed like that there was no avoiding the eventual fusion of these two dishes. So it happened that the BLT egg bake was eventually made, with all the comfort of a sandwich that you could have for lunch or breakfast, and all the crowd-filling capabilities of a baked egg casserole. It was a very flavorful, heavy dish that was a massively big upgrade from the canned, convenience-oriented cooking that the World War era brought on. Since this is our last round of items before we wrap the video up, I thought I'd save some of the most horrific ones for it. Creamed brains on toast is the top contender. This is exactly what you think it is, too. It's lamb, calf, or pig brains in a sauce that does it no favors or adds any flavor. I mean, really, stomach linings, feet, ears, brains, what was up with that? I get that there really has to be some advantage, situational or nutritional, that makes all these recipes worth it. But for the life of me, I just don't see it. Brains are a really inexpensive source of protein, which is something I can get. There was also the fact that before industrial meat processing, most butcher shops would sell whole animals. So it became common for Sunday suppers to make the most of that, especially because Sunday suppers were an event that people would usually bring a very empty stomach for. Unfortunately, this dish saw very little time at any table on Sunday, because besides all the reasons we've gone over on why offal isn't something people vibed with, yes, you read that right. This sounds like a dare, but it was once a quirky staple in Depression-era kitchens. Simple, affordable ingredients, cabbage and peanut butter rolls, were combined in a way that's unexpected but also surprisingly delicious if you give it a chance. Here's how it worked. Blanched large cabbage leaves were then spread with creamy peanut butter. The leaves were rolled up tight like little cabbage burritos and baked to soften and meld the flavors. The result? Oddly satisfying and packed with protein, a savory sweet combo that was perfect for families scraping by. Peanut butter was filling and hearty, and cabbage was cheap and plentiful, so everyone could get through another long day. In fact, some recipes included a drizzle of molasses or honey for extra sweetness. When times were tough, creativity like this filled plates and bellies. It may not sound like a five-star dish. Today, these rolls might be a curiosity, but they are a testament to the ingenuity of past generations. You may not see cabbage and peanut butter rolls on any menus these days, but there's no reason they couldn't be an oddball appetizer at your next retro dinner party. It'll be a conversation starter at least, if nothing else. Pasta primavera was something that was put into the American culinary scene thanks to one chef, Sirio Maccioni of Le Cirque, which is a restaurant in New York City, and a pretty recognizable one. That name may not mean much to you right now, but this was the brain that made pasta primavera a symbol of sophisticated upscale dining during the 1970s. The intent was to capitalize on the growing national interest in lighter food and foreign cuisines, and one of the first places Americans thought to look for inspiration was Europe, specifically French and Italian cuisines. Of course, the Italian immigrants who still vividly remembered their country's food and delicacies couldn't wait to jump on the opportunity. I mean, if you heard a title fight calling your name and you knew the opposition was a punk, wouldn't you go? And who was the opposition here? Beef jerky? The same meatloaf you've been having since the 50s? I think they all felt differently. It was something that even got too many cookbooks too. Nowadays, it's not a trendy restaurant dish, and you'd be hard-pressed to find places that were selling it as their main attraction. But it did still turn a lot of heads. Not all convenience food was bad, though. Some were the perfect thing for a party, and if you've ever had bacon roll-ups, you know just what I mean. These are one of the first definitions of finger food that you'll find throughout the wide lands of America. You take bacon, which is something that we all hold pretty dear to our hearts, grandma and grandkid alike, and you wrap it around this cream cheese pastry filling that then gets baked until it's crispy. Think thinner vegetable rolls, but they're filled with bacon and cheese instead. As far as appetizers went, this was like the Britney Spears of the entire industry. It became near impossible to beat it because of how versatile, easy, and delicious it was. Something home cooks could make in literally some minutes and serve to an entire crowd. That wasn't its biggest strength, though. The real pull of a bacon roll-up is having 10 different kinds of cards to play, but all in one. This is because the fillings can be switched around with different ingredients. You can make it a meat-only filling, a vegan-friendly filling, a seafood filling, a mushroom-based one. You get the idea. There's a lot of versatility to go around, even more than there are bacon roll-ups. Sure, they might not be the best for your heart, but whenever these were up at a party, you could almost be guaranteed that platters would be emptied out completely afterwards. There was also mass hysteria about mad cow disease spreading thanks to eating brains. Potted meatloaf was a preserved meat spread that was prepared by slow-cooking ground meats, like beef or pork with a lot of fat and seasonings. Then you would just pack it all into a jar or a crock and seal it with a nice little layer of fat. Think of it like a transportable plate. It was something people would typically use as a spread for bread or a dip for crackers. This was also one of the most common preservation methods before the advent of modern refrigeration. Even when refrigeration eventually did come around, it took quite a while before it became a household concept everywhere. Potted meat, on the other hand, was a technique people had been working with for centuries and were all too familiar with. When those things did come around, though, people were really quick to abandon tradition. I mean, it was also because most advancements were copying the concept of potting your meat to begin with. That's what Spam essentially was. Homemade potting disappeared, though, and most American homes stopped making potted meatloaves as a result. It wasn't a tasty thing, although it wasn't exactly very good. It just became redundant. Mock turtle soup is not for the faint of heart or the literal-minded. Real turtle soup was a delicacy that most people couldn't afford in the 1800s, and this dish grew out of that. A budget-friendly stand-in that would enter the calf's head, a gelatinous texture and deep flavor of turtle meat. Yes, you read that right, calf's head. Mock turtle soup was a process. The meat was boiled, the head boiled, to extract every ounce of flavor, and then chopped bits of meat, sometimes including the brain and tongue, were added to the broth. It became a rich, savory stew with the help of spices, sherry, and a bit of lemon juice. And somehow, it worked. Those who wanted to feel fancy without actually having to shell out for real turtles made this a Sunday staple. It even made its way into pop culture, most notably in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which a character called the Mock Turtle complained about his existence. The idea of boiling a calf's head may not win hearts today, but mock turtle soup was the epitome of resourcefulness and culinary creativity. Once the stuff of luxury on a budget, it's a meal that proves ingenuity could make even the most esoteric ingredients unforgettable. You can honestly make the exact same argument, but in a different way, for turkey croquettes. I know you're immediately going to ask what was so special or riveting about croquettes done with turkey instead of the usual chicken. Well, the thing is, it wasn't so much the croquettes as much as it was that this dish showed Americans other avenues for Thanksgiving food. Hey, nothing's replacing the big fat center stage turkey, but people thought that you could also add to the overall vibe and atmosphere of Thanksgiving if you doubled down on the inclination for turkey. They were also a wonderful way to repurpose any sort of leftover turkey, and in an era that was constantly heading towards lighter foods, smaller plates, and overall more greens, they didn't exactly know how to start using their turkey in different ways. Croquettes, on the other hand, were perfect for a few more reasons than just being a different kind of way of using your turkey. You couldn't spend 15-20 minutes making and assembling a turkey sandwich, especially when streaming services weren't a thing. If you missed your TV back then, you could honestly just consider it gone. Turkey croquettes were easy to make ahead of time, and they were a fun way of handling a lot of meat that would otherwise just go to waste sitting in your fridge. That's the end of 2 hours of Sunday suppers no one makes anymore. Drop your favorite in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe.